If you ever played the Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep DLC for Borderlands 2 and you're part of the community, you probably heard the phrase, "I would love to play a full-scale version of this DLC." 2K invited me to play Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, and that's pretty much what it feels like. I've played the first few hours of the game a couple times through with different characters, and so I just wanted to share my impressions with you guys and let you know what it's about a few days before the game actually comes out on the 25th. Thanks to 2K for providing the code. If I were to give you like an elevator pitch one-liner on what this game is, it very much just is Borderlands. I mean, there's really no way about it. There are a few things that do change, such as the open world being like slightly less open. You have this tabletop RPG, Dungeons and Dragons style overworld where you explore and then you go into different locations, and it does the Pokemon thing where you go into grass and then suddenly there's an encounter and then you go and like fight some enemies. Instead of grenades, you have spells, which is, I would say, like a small difference just because the grenades really kind of got crazy in the Borderlands games, especially in Borderlands 3. And then you've got something called the multi-class system, which I actually didn't get to because once again, I only played the first few hours of the game that I could show you guys. But by and large, I think it's a bit of a mistake to look at Tiny Tina's Wonderlands and think it's very different from Borderlands. It's really not. It's like Borderlands with a slightly different coat of paint, I would say. So in the first couple hours of the game, obviously it's big, introduction and sort of expository stuff about the story. You are literally someone playing D&D next to Tiny Tina and two other characters, Valentine and Fret, in the real world, so to speak. And then after you've established that, you pick your character class and you're plopped into the world. Tiny Tina is in control of this world, very much like a dungeon master would be in a game of D&D, but it's bunkers and badasses, which is the Borderlands version of D&D. And there's a lot of like D&D humor sprinkled in here. Now, I'm not someone personally who's into D&D. I haven't even played D&D, so maybe a lot of this humor is going over my head, but you can see little sprinkles of it throughout. There's a lot of sort of, jokes in the jokey Borderlands way. When you're in the overworld, you can collect these dice, and of course, they look like D&D dice. Another big addition that they show you really early is the melee system. So you can actually equip melee weapons in this game. They have their own stats, so that's definitely something that's new, but it's not like a super big thing, I would say. I mean, there are certain classes that specialize in melee, but by and large, I mean, you can sort of like teleport towards enemies with the melee weapon and whack them. I'm sure you could specialize in melee for a specific build, but it really doesn't change the game, in my opinion. It's kind of just like an addition or an add-on or a little twist. But the flow of this game is Borderlands. I mean, you're hearing dialogue, you're walking up to characters, they're talking at you, and you just, respond. And one thing I forgot to mention is the character creation system. It's really robust, and that is something new for Borderlands. Of course, I made my guy completely ridiculous, and I gave him this snarky voice, and I also gave him an archetype of being the village idiot, which is pretty funny. So you will hear the outcome of your character's personality in certain conversations. And it did make me laugh a couple times, even in the first, few hours of the game. I also noticed some returning voices. So you meet this character, Paladin Mike, that is absolutely the same character and the same voice from Borderlands 3's Lorelei. And I didn't really like Lorelei. Lorelei was kind of annoying to me. So I was like, oh no, we get more of this person. But yeah, pretty quickly you get into the flow of things and you get a couple weapons and kind of teach you about the mechanics. And I really do kind of like the setting of Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. And I think I preferred Borderlands, but after 3 games, I didn't want another like abandoned wasteland apocalypse kind of thing, That would have been tired and sort of boring, I think, for, a 4th Borderlands game, at least this so soon after Borderlands 3. So to see them go to a different setting and make it more fantasy, inspired, but still with the guns, I think was a smart move. But I think you could very easily look at gameplay of Tiny Tina's and be like, that could be, DLC for Borderlands 3. And I'm totally not suggesting that. I'm sure there's plenty of depth and breadth in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. There's some interesting changes, but at the same time, it definitely feels like a spin-off of Borderlands 3 in that It's not this massive leap. It doesn't feel like the leap from 1 to 2, and it definitely doesn't feel like the leap from 2 to 3. But that doesn't mean it's not worth it, and it's not worth your time, at least from my experience so far. Now, I think Borderlands games are much, much better and should be played co-op, actually. It just feels like that's the kind of experience that these games were meant to be played with. I mean, you can listen to the dialogue, you can sit down and listen to the audio tracks and the writing. I just don't know that the Borderlands style of jokes, the rapid fire, the super silliness is something that I think is super funny anymore. Almost like I've aged out of it. The humor just bounces off of me. However, I will say that the main villain is voiced by Will Arnett, and he did a really good job. I really like Will Arnett, so the fact that I know who that is and, you know, his voice is pretty much perfect for this goofy sort of supervillain in Tiny Tina. I really like that. I also like that this is a Borderlands-esque game that is not super serious. Sometimes Borderlands, I mean, I know Borderlands has never been really, really serious, but sometimes they do kind of like they like spin it and they're like, oh yeah, you should really care about these characters. And almost every time, I didn't really care. It seems like Tiny Tina's just ditches that entirely. They're really not trying to give an emotional edge, at least from what I could tell so far. You know, they know it's ridiculous. They know, you know you're playing a game of D&D next to Tiny Tina. There's no actual stakes here. So that really seems to free this game to do whatever and be completely ridiculous. Now, there are 6 character classes in Tiny Tina's Wonderlands and the multi-class system, so you've really got a lot of gameplay variety in terms of that. But remember, it's still Borderlands, so you're mostly just shooting. And, you know, maybe you're using different weapons and, you know, using skills at a certain time in order to maximize your damage. But by and large, the gameplay experience is mostly the same across these classes. That's what I found after running a couple of them through the same sections. On my first playthrough, I used the Clawbringer, which has this little wyvern companion that sort of flies around and shoots fire at enemies. And then I could actually do this big hammer attack as my active skill, and then there's a second active skill that you can switch between, so you can only use one of those at the time. The other one I used is kind of this Thor hammer where you could throw it and it would electrocute enemies, and then you could retrieve it, and the damage that it deals on the way back was pretty good too. So again, very much just like Thor's hammer. I've got to say, I'm a little disappointed in these classes. I don't know what it is. Maybe I didn't get far enough, but nothing really spoke to me as like, yeah, I want to be this class. I mean, they do some interesting things to try to distinguish these from previous Borderlands archetypes, but at the end of the day, like the Stabomancer, while it is supposed to be this magic-y assassin, still just feels like an assassin. You're still just going after critical hits, and that's just like an experience I've already, you know, gone through with like the Hunter, dating back to Borderlands 1, and you know, the magey type just feels like Lilith, for example, you know, so, or Amara. So it just feels like they tried to distinguish these classes and make them different, but either they're not imaginative enough or they're just not different enough to really feel unique from what we've seen before, from what I've played so far. So the classes I tried were the Clawbringer, as I mentioned, the Stabomancer, and the Spell Shot. And I think out of those, I liked the Spell Shot the most, once again, because it uses the new mechanics with the spells. But I mean, I might try the Spore Warden. Again, I just wasn't super gripped by any one class. And hey, maybe that's something you just need to play more of the game in order to figure out like, yes, I do like this class. And as you play more of Borderlands games, you do kind of see more of how the class works. So that is something to note as well. And then one more thing I forgot to mention, when you actually create your character, you get to spend some points, and every time you level up, you get 1 point to spend in these, you know, stats that you would see in any other RPG, like strength, health, you know, dexterity, intelligence, stuff like that. And they affect things like crit chance and crit damage and melee damage and so on and so forth. But yeah, I think really your takeaway from this video should be that Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is just more Borderlands. It really is. The changes are not enough to sort of cement it as something else. The gameplay, moment-to-moment experience is very much the same. And if that's something that you want, then I think you're going to be really happy with it. I mean, there's vending machines, you know, you're gathering weapons and you frequently have too much in your bag, so you have to sell it, which I've always found to be kind of annoying in the Borderlands games. But the moment-to-moment gunplay is still great. It's really fun. And I like the way that certain status effects work. Like freezing works really well on the undead, on skeletons. So I used that in the first part of the game and just absolutely wrecked these guys. When the full game comes out, I definitely see this as a game where I just play through the main stuff, or if I get some friends and rally them together to play through with me, then I'll play through everything. But I can't really see myself 100%ing this video game. It just feels like it's too similar to what I've played before. If that's what you're looking for, then I think you're going to be really happy. And if you're really into the Borderlands universe, I think there's going to be a lot here that you're going to like, a lot of nods to the previous games. And of course, it's the same humor and the same frame as previous games. So that is it from my experience with Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. I hope this helped you guys kind of learn more about the game and figure out if you want to grab it or not. I had a pretty good time playing it, and I definitely will continue to play it when the game comes out in a couple of days. So once again, thank you to 2K for sending me a code and letting me share it with you guys here today. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button. Also, subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss more videos. Click that bell as well so you get notifications whenever I upload. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.